Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. I'm Sandra Lubarski, and I'm the president of Flagstaff College in Flagstaff, Arizona. We are a small micro college that takes global warming seriously. And we believe that education should help us to address the great environmental and social challenges of our time. We offer one major. The major is sustainability and social change, and we focus on the integration of ideas and on their implementation in the world. We also believe that education happens best when small groups of dedicated people gather together to learn from each other. We're accepting students for the fall semester, and we have generous scholarships available. You can find out more about us if you go to our social media, our various social media links that we're going to put in that are already in the chat there. So you can follow us on Instagram and on Facebook and also on our webpage. We're very grateful to Dr. Stephen Mulkey tonight for speaking with us on the latest IPCC report. He's going to give an overview of that report. And if you have questions and answers, please put them in the Q&A box, and he'll spend time addressing those. And now I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Marcus Ford, who is the co-founder of Flagstaff College, and he'll introduce Dr. Mulkey. But thanks everyone and welcome.
Well, thank you, Sandra. Good evening. It's such a pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Stephen Mulkey, who will walk us through the latest IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, with a special emphasis on the work of Working Group 3, the kind of what can we do group. There are scientists who, for a variety of reasons, prefer not to speak to the public, and there are scientists who are quite willing to speak to the public, but aren't particularly good at it. But there's another category of scientists, perhaps the majority of scientists, who are both willing and able to talk about science, so long as they don't have to venture into policy recommendations or, God forbid, draw any sort of ethical conclusions based on their research. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Mulkey, is the rarest of scientists in that he's a first-rate scientist who is willing and able and even eager to engage with the public, and who is willing to share his own views on what these findings mean in terms of public policy and ethical responsibilities. We're very fortunate to have him with us tonight. I should mention that Stephen maintains a blog, the Environmental Century, at environmentalcentury.net, N-E-T. If you find his remarks tonight helpful, as I predict you will, you'll want to check out his blog. So please welcome Dr. Mulkey. Stephen.
Thank you, Marcus and Sandra, and thanks to the team that's supporting this webinar. I want to say just how grateful I am to be a part of getting Flagstaff College started, and I hope that what my remarks tonight are useful in that regard. I entitled my talk, Finding Vital Purpose in a Season of Urgent Transformation. And this is not good news, folks. This is very grim news. If you had asked me 10 years ago if we would be in the situation we are in today, I would have said probably not. I think we will make the turn, that we will begin to get rid of our carbon emissions, and we will start to manage the biosphere and the ecosystems that have been so devastated. And in fact, we haven't done any of that, and things have progressively gotten worse, and we're staring down the barrel of a very severe situation. And I think that becomes clear in assessment report number 6. Mitigation and adaptation of global heating on a global scale must be the primary work of humanity. Failure to stabilize the Earth system will massively cripple or possibly end civilization. So these are really strong projections, and I think there's very little that's taking us off of this track right now, despite all of the meetings, despite all of the science that's been produced, literally tens of thousands of scientific papers, virtually 100% in support of the urgency of addressing this. I had lunch with a colleague at the University of Florida the other day, and he said, I'll quote what he said, and I think it's appropriate for this circumstance. It's urgent that we act with vital purpose and exuberant resolve. Now, climate change communicators will tell you not to be too blunt about how difficult the situation we are in, for the simple reason that people will feel hopeless and not act. I think we're beyond that. I want you to be afraid. I'm afraid. I'm alarmed, but I'm not an alarmist. I've been doing this for well over 25 years, and I've watched the situation on this planet deteriorate further and further. So let's get started. Antonio Guterres, our UN Secretary General, who's our top diplomat, says the jury has reached a verdict, and it is damning. This report is a litany of broken promises. It is a file of shame cataloging the empty pledges that put us firmly on track towards a world, an unlivable world. I like my colleague, Wendell Porter, who's a renowned energy expert. He says this will be a fight to the end of our days and beyond, mitigation to whatever level we can, and then centuries of adaptation. This is not a sprint. This is a long marathon that we're engaged in, and we must begin immediately. I especially love what Terry Tempest Williams has to say. She's a world-renowned poet and writer. She's written quite a bit about the American West, but she's broader than that. I had her as a commencement speaker when we were privileged to have her at Unity College when I was president of that college. And she says, I think this is where we are. We're in this time where everything is being turned inside out, including us. Do we have the stamina to not walk away, to stay in this hard place of transformation? This speaks to our affective internal state, and it certainly speaks to mine. And transformation is the key word here. Incremental change won't do it. We're facing big changes. So working group 1 is the physical science basis, and it's getting hotter and weather is becoming more extreme. You can see in the top left that the land and the oceans are warming at different rates. The oceans are warming more slowly because of the huge thermal mass that they have. Global heating, according to the IPCC, has been 1.1 degrees relative to pre-industrial, which they define as 1850 to 1900. And air temperatures are increasing faster over land than over ocean, and every decade since 1980 was the warmest decade on record at the time. These data are perhaps the most compelling that I know of because they're the tightest and most reliable. This all comes from ice cores in Antarctica. And we're seeing the exponential rise of the primary greenhouse gases that are attached to civilization and to the Industrial Revolution: carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. This is the rise in fossil fuel emissions and from land use and land use change. Let's put this in context. Our current emissions trajectory is unprecedented and utterly catastrophic. You can see that if we go back to 20,000 years ago, the lower left-hand corner of this graph, and we move forward in time, we've been steadily warming. That's because of the Earth's position in space and its interception of sunlight. Except for a very brief period of cooling, we entered a period known as the Holocene, which is this blue pattern. And you can see where we're headed. This is very bad news, of course. But the Holocene is possibly the most stable interglacial period over the last 1.5 million years of glacial advance and retreat. All of civilization and agriculture developed during this time. We refer to it as the Goldilocks climate: not too hot, not too cold. So concentrations of carbon dioxide are higher now than they've been since the Pliocene, 3 to 4 million years ago. And the rate of CO2 release is unprecedented in about 66 million years. Ocean acidity has increased 26%, that CO2 dissolves in the water. and the rate of acidification is 10 times faster than any acidification event in the oceans for over 55 million years, and quite likely or possibly for over 250 million years since the Great Permian extinction. So another group called Berkeley Earth puts us at 1.3 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial period. And Berkeley Earth is widely regarded by many as having the best temperature analysis going. And they point out that in the coterminous United States in 2020, we had already hit 1.7. So certain regions are warming more than 1.1. And this is alarming to say the least, but so don't be lulled into thinking that, oh, we're only at 1.1, we've got running room. We have no running room. Working Group 1 set out the response of the climate system relative to 1850 to 1900. Looking on the left-hand column, temperature, drought, precipitation, diminishing snow cover, and increasing strength of tropical cyclones. We're already at 1.1 degrees Celsius today, and our temperature on the hottest day has already increased 1.2 degrees Celsius. Drought is double what it was. You can see that as we move on to 1.5 and 2.0, that our situation gets progressively worse, and in particular, the tropical cyclones get much stronger, and there's more disaster awaiting us. We will be very hard pressed to stay below 2 degrees Celsius. And as you'll see toward the end, most of the scientists that wrote this report think that we will hit 3 degrees Celsius. So 4 degrees, we could talk about that, but civilization ends at 4. There's no question that anything resembling the civilization we currently have would become impossible at 4 degrees Celsius global average warming. Well, warm air can hold more moisture than cool air, and for every degree Celsius increase in the global average temperature relative to pre-industrial, the atmosphere can hold on average about 7% more water vapor. I emphasize the can because once it gets the water, there's more energy aloft, and it often releases it as heavy precipitation. On the left-hand side, you see the heavy precipitation events over a 10-year period. And just looking at 2 degrees Celsius, you see that they will be 1.7 times more likely. Agricultural droughts are of an increasing concern because we're looking at multiple breadbasket failures now, and this is probably going to increase in the future. So the frequency per 10 years of these extreme droughts at 2 degrees Celsius is they will occur 2.4 times more likely. Soil moisture, some regions will become drier and some regions will become wetter, according to Working Group 1. The annual, the regions at 1.5 and 2 degrees and at 4 degrees are shown here in these maps. I want to emphasize one thing in particular, and that's the Amazon basin. The Amazon basin is one of the most immense carbon stores in the world, and it is drying out and rapidly becoming a carbon source to the atmosphere. It will amplify global heating. Of course, you should note the drying in the Great Plains states of the United States and in Canada, the breadbasket of North America. The reason why the Amazon basin is so important is because it is immense. You could fit all of Western Europe and the UK into it and still have room to spare. And vast regions of the Amazon have already become carbon sources. There are a couple of references down here that I would refer you to that document, among many others, how rapidly the region is transforming. It's approaching a tipping point where climate change and forest disruption will cause a biome-wide regime shift within this decade toward a more savanna-like biome, especially in the southeast of the Amazon. The drivers are drought amplified by global heating, fire also amplified by global heating, logging to create agricultural land for soy in particular and for beef in particular, road building, deforestation for timber, and forest fragmentation. The Amazon is under imminent threat. Regions all over the world will face increased drought and increased flood risk toward the end of the century. Both drought and flood will be amplified because of this higher water vapor holding capacity of the warm air. This analysis in particular uses a medium emissions scenario that's consistent with the current policies and pledges. So this is a very sobering set of data to me. Let's move on to working group 2, which considered impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. We really have two choices at their extreme and a continuum of outcomes in between over time. We can, right now, we're headed solidly toward a degraded ecosystems of the world, both in montane, terrestrial, freshwater, aquatic, urban, and in coastal and in marine. Many of these systems are irretrievable. They will be permanently damaged if we continue, permanently meaning within any meaningful human time frame. If we continue with the track that we're on. We could, however, engage in that exuberance and engage the problem that we're facing, and we could build healthy ecosystems with all of the ecosystem services that would give us and the biodiversity benefits that come along with those ecosystem services. I should say actually cause those ecosystem services. The co-chair of the IPCC Working Group 2 said, "The science is clear. Any further delay in concerted global action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future." Antonio Gutierrez once again weighs in and he says, "I've seen many scientific reports in my time, and I'm on the same page with him here, but nothing like this one. It's an atlas of human suffering and a damning indictment of failed climate leadership. This abdication of leadership is criminal. The world's biggest polluters are guilty of arson of our only home." I certainly would apply that to the fossil fuel companies. One of my most respected climate scientists out there is Kim Cobb. I follow her work closely. She was at Georgia Tech for many years. She's just been tapped to lead a major center at Brown University, and I think she's somebody you might want to follow. She says our decisions over the next 10 years will affect the magnitude of climate change for centuries to come. That's certainly true. I want to zero in on some key definitions. What is adaptation? Adaptation plays a key role in reducing exposure and vulnerability to climate change. It can be proactive or reactive, as well as incremental or transformational. Proactive adaptation is far less expensive and disruptive and damaging in terms of material wealth and lives and livelihoods than is reactive adaptation. I assure you, we will adapt, but we don't want our adaptation to be reactive. Resilience is a term that's thrown around a lot. It's adaptation is often organized around the concept of resilience as bouncing back and returning to a previous state after a disturbance. If you think about this for a nanosecond, you realize this is a stupid idea. The term describes not just the ability to maintain essential function and structure, and we don't want to go back to what was, but we need to institutionalize the capacity for ongoing transformation, because the climate and the Earth system is not going to stop changing, and the changes are coming faster. Transformation is what Working Group 2 emphasizes. It changes the fundamental attributes of social ecological systems in anticipation of climate change and its impacts. We're falling behind on adaptation. Every small increase in warming will result in escalating losses and damages across many systems. Up to 3 billion people are projected to experience chronic water scarcity due to droughts at 2 degrees Celsius warming, and up to 4 billion at 4 degrees warming, mostly across the subtropics and the mid-latitudes. By 2030, about 250 million people may experience a high water stress in Africa, with up to 700 million people displaced as a result. That's half the population of Africa. within the next decade. That's an astonishing figure, and I double checked it. It's in chapter 9 of Working Group 2. And the displacement will mostly be internal within countries, but much of it will also cross geopolitical borders. Projected flood damages will be up to 2 times higher at 2 degrees warming and up to 3.9 times higher at 3 degrees when compared to damages at 1.5. Up to 18% of those species assessed on land will be at high risk of extinction if we warm 2 degrees Celsius by 2100. If the world warms up to 4, roughly 50%, 1 out of every 2 plant and animal species assessed, will be threatened. We're facing local, regional, and global extinction possibilities. The column on the left shows you the different temperature demarcations moving into the future for the oceans and the land. And you can see that the percentage of species exposed to potentially dangerous climate solutions is increasing as it gets hotter and hotter. And much of this is centered around the equator, but it also comes very strongly into the mid-latitudes at 2 and 3 degrees Celsius. If we look at the actual loss of terrestrial and freshwater biodiversity compared to the pre-industrial period, you can see that many regions are going to be severely affected at 2 and 3 degrees Celsius. Again, 4 degrees is unconscionable. If we look at the same set of data for changes in marine species richness in 2100 compared to 2006, again, most of the losses are going to occur around the equator, but 2.5 is, again, a temperature that we will very possibly see if we don't make drastic, comprehensive changes. And you can see that where the marine species are in serious trouble. Many of them will be able to migrate north to the poles from the equator, but by far that's less than 50% of them. As urban growth continues, you can see that the urban areas of Africa and Asia are going to get bigger. And if we look at the number of days per year when the air temperature and humidity conditions pose a risk of death from 1 day to 365 days, you can see that already the historical period regions in Indonesia and Southeast Asia and India have already been severely affected. If we look at what would be like at 2 degrees Celsius at mid-century, 2041 to 2060, you can see that Indonesia is really hammered. India, Pakistan, much of the Amazon basin and around the Isthmus of Panama, up into the southern part of the United States, the risk of death from heat is exponentially rising. And in fact, I just saw a paper today that documented it in the Lancet in terms of all-cause mortality. It's grim reading. Primary vector-borne diseases will expand. If you take global heating plus urbanization, you add in Chagas disease, malaria, dengue, and Zika, and Lyme disease, and leishmaniasis, we'll see an increase in these vector-borne diseases, very much so in the southern mid-latitudes, moving into the temperate zone in North America and in Europe and in Asia. Our global food supply is at extreme risk right now. Climate change is affecting food security through pervasive water impacts. The impacts are being felt in every water use sector, more so in agriculture, which globally consumes over 80% of the total water. So you can see the drought-related and other climate-related food production losses moving forward in time, getting worse. Even warming below 1.6 degrees Celsius, we will see 8% of today's farmland become climatically unsuitable by 2100. We can't afford to lose 8%. We're already at the bleeding edge in terms of our ability to feed our populations. The loss of the Ukraine wheat harvest this year, it's the 5th largest wheat harvest in the world, is absolutely devastating. Multiple simultaneous breadbaskets have already occurred, and this trend will certainly get worse. There will be a number of disasters, and cyclones are right at the top of the list, and fires come second. I'll talk about cyclones and fires very briefly. First, I want to talk about the concept of attribution to climate change. All weather now occurs in a human-altered climate. That means when an event occurs, you don't ask the question, did climate change cause this? You ask the question instead, which attributes or which features of that event can be attributed through science to climate change. And the one thing we know about cyclones, especially Atlantic hurricanes, is that monster storms are growing more common. They're stronger because of much hotter oceans. Category 4 and Category 5 are becoming more common. Hurricanes are becoming more frequent, and this will get worse. The projections are for increased frequency. They're slower because of reduced temperature gradient between the pole and the equator, which reduces the winds that drive hurricanes northward. They're wetter because the storms take up more water as they move slowly over hot ocean. They intensify more quickly because wind shear, one of the things that reduces the power of a hurricane, is actually reduced in the Northern Caribbean and near the US Atlantic coast. And hurricanes retain power and much, much more precipitation further inland. And they're moving poleward, which means that in the Northern Hemisphere, regions like New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, Maine, New England in general are under increasing threat from these very large storms and up into Nova Scotia and into Canada. Fires are also one of our biggest concerns, and we can see that moving historically up through time from 1980 to 2020, the fire weather has increased, the initial spread of those fires has also increased, and the water vapor in the air has decreased. So the deficit of water vapor is less and less. This hotter air helps to drive a drying out and drive these fires. This trend was almost certainly to get worse. And our fire season has already started in the American West. And so you ain't seen nothing yet, folks. We've got a real challenge ahead to manage these fires. Working Group 2's main messages: temperatures will exceed 1.5 by 2030. Certainly, and possibly at least for part of the globe within the next 5 years. I would say certainly for part of the globe within the next 5 years. Cascading and compound impacts are appearing faster and are more severe sooner than predicted. We have all the technical and policy solutions we need to transition away from fossil fuels. We need to preserve at least 50% of the terrestrial biosphere to manage the carbon emissions from these damaged ecosystems. The global south has been proportionally left out of adaptation resources. There has been utterly no interruption of the accelerating fossil fuel extraction in poorer nations. Various efforts that lock in infrastructure are identified by Working Group 2 as maladaptation because they attract investment that will only eventually be lost. Seawalls and pumps, such as those being installed in Southeast Florida, are the example that they explicitly use. Impacts on global health are severe and interacting to produce compounded effects across the entire spectrum of disease and disability. And return to the status quo after adaptive is explicitly identified as a maladaptive strategy by Working Group 2. Only large-scale transformation of civilization itself will suffice. So let's turn now to Working Group 3, where they talk about the urgency of massive transformation and the opportunities for mitigation. To stay below 2 degrees Celsius means deep economic and structural changes worldwide. Emissions must peak and begin to fall in 3 years by 2025 to achieve 1.5 and not have any overshoot, which could severely damage ecosystems. We're looking at massive transformation in energy systems, in industry, in transportation, in the built environment, in forestry and agriculture. And this working group uses silver buckshot instead of just a few silver bullets. It's resistance and corruption. This is their top concern, corporate and political resistance and corruption. Restore landscapes and transform agriculture and forestry, transform buildings and the built environment, decarbonize industry and power production, kill coal now, and kill fossil gas as absolutely as fast as possible. Low carbon and zero emissions transport are essential. Massively scale up renewables, massively scale down demand for energy intensive goods and services, especially when those goods and services are derived from fossil fuels. And wealthy nations have most of the responsibility for demand side reductions, yet emissions continue to grow. These are the greenhouse gas emissions over time up through 2019. You can see the developed countries in the bright red, and in the darker red, Asia and the developing Pacific are responsible for the lion's share. The developed countries of the global north are largely responsible for the historical cumulative net anthropogenic CO2 emissions. In North America, essentially the United States is right at the top of the list. Europe comes in next for those cumulative emissions. If we look at per capita emissions, again, the United States and North America are right at the top of the list. Other developed nations come in closely thereafter. And the two things that drive emissions, of course, are the fossil fuel industry and CO2 from land use change, and deforestation in particular. So who's responsible? Well, the US is, put bluntly, really simply. The fossil emissions, the cumulative emissions, and the land use change emissions put us squarely at the top of the list of cumulative emissions since 1850 to 2021. As of 2020, the US share was 25%. The other parts of the world are sadly catching up. In 1960, our share was 40%. Including exports and imports. Imported and exported carbon has very little effect on the overall absolute values or the ranking. One of the things that was most disturbing to me is a recent paper that appeared in The Lancet. It was written by Hickel, and it shows that the United States and the UK plus the EU are responsible for 74% of global excess material use. This means above what is sustainable for the entire planet and quantified as fair share of total material resources available. It's primarily driven by the US and the EU 28. Excess material use or consumption is the immediate cause of habitat destruction, extinctions, and climate change. These are very sobering numbers to me, and it really causes deep introspection. Working Group 2 outlines a strategy for avoid, shift, and improve. For making decisions across different income groups, it says we need to develop sustainable infrastructure and foster social trust and governance. And we need to tilt the use of resources more toward the bottom 90% and away from consumption by the top 10% and the top 1%. And they point out the need to transform political culture and for responsible investment, for responsible consumption, and introduce new social norms such as not eating meat and especially not eating beef, which is by far the biggest offender, and plan our infrastructure for low carbon. Wealthy nations, above all, must stop using most of the resources and allocate more of the proportional share to the global south and the poorer nations. And fossil fuel use, contrary to popular conception, is not demand driven. It's rather supply driven. If you look at all the reasons we're given to burn fossil fuels, it's actually supply driven. We demand services, not the fossil fuels per se, and it's very possible to decouple the use of fossil fuels from the services that we need for a good life. Using a wide range of demand side options in transport, building, and food, telecommuting, one less long haul flight, living car free. I ride a minimal assist electric bicycle back and forth from the university, and I fill up my Prius, my 10-gallon tank in my Prius about once every 2 months. So effectively, I'm getting close to being car free. Vegetarian diet, even better, a vegan diet, and the US desperately needs to upgrade its public transport. Heat pumps. I installed an air source heat pump in my home in Gainesville a year ago, and it is fantastic. It has saved me so much money, and it has decoupled my home from fossil gas. Refurbishment and renovation, renewable electricity, and battery electric vehicles. If we're to stay below 1.5, we need to leave in the ground by 2050, 58% of the oil, 59% of the fossil gas, and 89% of the coal. The good news is that costs are falling and adoption is skyrocketing for photovoltaics, onshore wind, offshore wind, and even to some extent for concentrating solar power, which is still approaching an economy of scale, and batteries for passenger electric vehicles, rapid adoption and plummeting cost per unit. So this is really very good news, especially for those batteries and for photovoltaics. And the worldwide adoption shows that we're at least headed in the right direction here. But our options for 2030, we have known what needs to be done for at least 4 decades. So I want to point out the main transformations that Working Group 3 is focused on. One is wind energy, solar energy, of course. The other is carbon sequestration in agriculture. We waste so much carbon in agriculture. Reduce conversion of forest and other ecosystems, ecosystem restoration, afforestation and forest management, reforestation. Afforestation is growing trees where they typically have not grown since the last glacial maximum, but could grow if we manage them. And fuel switching, electrifying everything. One of the things that's most telling to me is that the transport sector actually makes money relative to the reference case over the near term. So shifting transport to these different modes of transportation that are not carbon based actually saves us incredible resources as well as carbon and as well as money. The carbon dioxide removal will probably be required if we are to stay below 2 degrees Celsius and below 1.5. The implemented policies from the Paris agreements are in the orange here. They're taking us someplace we definitely don't want to go, at least 2 degrees warming and possibly as high as 3.2. But if we look at what it's going to take to stay below 1.5 with limited overshoot, we will have to remove carbon from the atmosphere. Here is a menu for carbon dioxide removal, CDR. The removal process is land-based, ocean-based, biological, geothermal, or chemical. And the timescales for storage of that carbon can be decades to centuries, centuries to millennia, and 10,000 years or longer. Across the bottom, you can see the various storage media, buildings, vegetation, soils, geological formations, minerals. And I'll just mention a few up at the top: afforestation, reforestation, improved management of forests, soil carbon sequestration in agriculture, enhanced weathering of silicate rocks, which is normally how the earth captures CO2, but we can speed up the process. Peatland restoration and coastal wetland restoration and maintenance of what's known as blue carbon on the coasts. One thing I want to point out is perhaps the sickest and most heinous activity that I've ever run across in the literature from the fossil fuel industry. And that is, anytime you see the word storage, you need to realize that the fossil fuel industry is planning on capturing the CO2, although most of their facilities have failed to capture very much at this point. The technology really hasn't worked. But they're going to capture that CO2 and use it for tertiary oil production. Primary is the initial well. Secondary is fracking, and tertiary is enhanced oil recovery by pumping CO2 into the fractures to force out every last remaining amount of oil. EOR, or enhanced oil recovery. I can't think of anything more twisted or sick in our current environment, and they are already selling the CO2 for that purpose. The most important statements from Working Group 3, interactions among politics, economics, and power relationships are responsible for the lack of urgent action. Opposition from status quo interests, vested interests, and lack of low carbon financing are primary barriers to action. Climate science has been undermined by counter movements, media, and misinformation. Corporations are primary obstructionists to climate action. The report is very clear about that. Future CO2 emissions from existing fossil fuel infrastructure will result in overshooting 1.5 degrees Celsius. Existing infrastructure must be decommissioned. We need to walk away from it. Wealthy top 10% of individuals globally are responsible for 36 to 45% of global greenhouse gas emissions. No country is currently doing enough or even pledging enough. Tech-based carbon dioxide removal is needed only if we fail to kill fossil emissions and fail to manage land use in the biosphere. People need services that can be delivered without energy and materials derived from burning fossil fuels. And the massive subsidies for fossil fuels worldwide, running into the trillions of dollars, must end immediately. And incremental change is unacceptable. Only wholesale societal transformation will salvage a livable planet. This is a really tough message from Working Group 3. You won't find much of this in the summary for policymakers, but you will find it in the technical summary. That's the part that I strongly recommend you read. The summary for policymakers has been, shall we say, made more palatable rather than saying things quite as bluntly as it is said in the summary. The authors of the assessment report number 6 acknowledge we're in deep trouble. How much warming above pre-industrial times do you think is likely by 2100? The authors who responded said mostly we'll see 3 degrees. I agree with them. Do you think the world is experiencing a climate crisis? 88% yes. Do you think we'll see catastrophic impacts of climate change in your lifetime? 82% say yes. The fossil fuel industry is the enemy. There's no question about it. And their presence at the Conference of the Parties, which is the conference of 195 nations that occurred in Glasgow in November of 2021, just a few months ago, their presence at that conference, they had more formal delegates than any other single country, outnumbering all the national delegations. That tells you of the influence that they have. Greta Thunberg has a real skill for speaking the truth and laying it on the line. She said it is not a secret that COP26 is a failure. I agree with you. Some climate scientists tried to put the best face on it, but frankly, we got nowhere near where we would get. Michael Mann is arguably one of the most respected climate scientists in the world. And he states, the science we're doing is a threat to the world's most powerful and wealthiest special interests. They've made more money than in the history of money. They have used their immense resources to create fake scandals and fund global disinformation aimed at vilifying scientists and discrediting the science and misleading the public and policymakers. He says, arguably, it is the most villainous act in the history of human civilization, because it's about the short-term interests of a small number of plutocrats over the long-term welfare of this planet and all of the organisms, the people that live on it. So if you're young, you should be furious. You certainly have a right to be. The intergenerational inequities are profound. The current pledges will take you to annual exposure of heat waves to somewhat less than 50%. At 2 degrees, you can see that we're well over 30%, and at 1.5, we're still about 20%, and this is for the 2020 cohort. I was born in 1953, so the climate that I've experienced is way down here on the lower left. So the lifetime heat wave exposure at 1.5 is 4 times, at 2 degrees is 6 times, and with the current pledges, it will be 7 times. This is a statement that really gives me the chills. People born after 2000 will have never experienced the relatively stable climate of the 20th century. By late this century, there will be no one alive who has not lived on a progressively disrupted Earth. Change everything now. We simply must. I realize there are significant geopolitical issues with Russia and China, but obviously the United States has a moral obligation to lead on this and to make this our most important task. People are waking up all over the world and demanding change. I am S. Mulkey at UFL. Send me your comments, your critiques, and your corrections. I'm happy to dialogue with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mulkey. It is distressing to hear what you have, your summary of the report. It's extremely helpful. It's not being reported the way it needs to be reported. I went out myself to try to read portions of the report, and it's a very dense document to read. And we need more people like you who are synthesizing this for us and lifting up the major points, and also the practices that we can all engage in. We have a couple questions that are coming forward. One is, can you speak to so-called renewable biofuel biomass energy generation? In your town, Gainesville, a plant was recently built. And then what do you see as the role for nuclear power in energy regeneration or energy generation going forward?
I'd be happy to address that. It depends on how bioenergy is defined. The European Union has, since around 2006, defined it incorrectly. And so they're including wood biomass as a renewable energy resource. And all of that depends on the timeline and how fast it is burned to make electricity. And in fact, that burning, if it's very fast, can actually add more per unit energy to CO2 to the atmosphere than burning the coal itself. So one of my primary concerns is all of the additional fossil fuels that are burned in maintaining the plantations, harvesting them, pelletizing them, putting them on barges and shipping them all across the Atlantic to fire the power plants of Europe. And by the time you put it on a train and eventually get it to those power plants, you have a huge carbon debt associated with the harvesting of trees in the American Southeast. That's a primary industry in the Southeast. It's a vested interest, and it's doing a lot of damage to the atmosphere. Can biofuels be done sustainably? Yes, they can, but you have to make sure that the photosynthesis that recovers the carbon dioxide is on a timescale consistent with the burning of the biomass. And often that is very, very hard to do while maintaining our profligate consumption and driving the consumption engine of the developed world. The second part of that question was about Gainesville's biomass plant. I actually sat on the original County Energy Commission that looked at that plant, and then I went away for a decade. I built a program at another university, became a college president, went to the National Science Foundation as a program director, and then came back home where we have a house and a home. And I looked down the street from where I live, and I saw a huge smokestack sticking up in the air. And I inquired from my colleagues, I said, what is that? They said, oh, that's your biomass plant. They built a plant that was huge, much larger than we designed for. On the back of an envelope, we came up with some plans that would have been about a fifth the size of the plant that was built. They say that it's fired entirely with waste wood. I'm dubious, first of all. I need to see an audit to make certain that's true. But anyway, I have a number of issues with that biomass plant. But technically, according to the numbers they're showing, it is a sustainable, renewable energy source. But as I said, I would like to see some more numbers on very particular issues.
Dr. Mulkey, we got a couple questions here about the role of nuclear power. And I did see it was on one of those charts, but you didn't allude to it. So could you speak to the role there?
There's, in my opinion, and this is just my personal opinion, nuclear power can be done safely. It hasn't been. I mean, I think Fukushima speaks loudly to that. Chernobyl speaks loudly to that. 3 Mile Island was hardly a benign event. It was a very dangerous event. So the major nuclear accidents that we have had are certainly cause for pause. The only thing that can indemnify a nuclear power plant, regardless of size, are governments. There's no way to insure one. And accordingly, that's a major impediment to building them. And the cost for building major centralized nuclear power plants is absolutely far greater per unit energy produced than is building renewables. So the main impediment is actually the cost. We still haven't figured out what to do with the waste. But the good news is that third and possibly fourth generation nukes will produce very little waste and become much more manageable. So there is some technological hope there.
Let's see. I want to turn to a question that appeared in the comments, and that is a question about why do you think the summary for the policymakers by Working Group 3 was toned down and made more palatable?
That's actually true for all of the SPMs, the summary for policymakers for groups 1, 2, and 3, but especially for number 3. Number 3 had a whole lot of social science in it, and that is very, very welcome to those natural scientists like myself who felt very strongly that that needed to be the case throughout all of the assessment reports that I've been following for the last almost 30 years. So I guess it's not surprising. It has to be signed off by the governments of 195 nations. And so, and in fact, the entire process of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change can be somewhat tainted because of the political inclusion that's required in the process. For example, I believe it's chapter 13 of Working Group 3. There are 2 lead authors, and one of them is employed by Saudi Aramco. And that's the one that really emphasizes tech-based geoengineering. The tech-based geoengineering is the fossil fuel industry's dream come true. It allows them to continue polluting while we build this promise that we will pull the CO2 out of the air. So you shouldn't be too surprised. It is a political process. Now, that said, the scientists themselves have independence, and they're guaranteed independence. There's 95 to 98% turnover of those scientists in between assessment reports. There are thousands, tens of thousands of comments that come in from the draft reports that have to be responded to by each of the chapter's scientists. There are over 400 scientists typically for a working group, sometimes more than 700 from all over the world, representing academic institutions from everywhere. The United States by far does not dominate that international agenda. And it is truly an international effort and worthy of your respect. That's why I recommend you read the technical summaries, which are relatively accessible, but they are unmanaged by the political entities of those 195 nations.
Thanks for that explanation. I believe that this next question comes from someone who is who has the right to, as you say, be furious. This is a young person asking, how do we implement solutions you brought up?
Okay, well, let me show you another slide. Is my screen still displayed?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay. This arrived in my inbox this morning from the table of contents of One Earth, which is a leading new journal of environmental economics and natural sciences. It's off to a great start. It's been out for a couple of years. It's very highly respected. And this article really talks about, in a quantitative sense, the intersectional issues that we typically think of as being separate from carbon emissions and from carbon intensity. They're not. They're foundational. The intersectional issues include ensuring all people are financially secure, changing the rules so that economic and political power are more evenly spread, racial, indigenous, and gender justice, coordinating fiscal and monetary policy so that this Green New Deal can be financed, green investment banks, ensuring all have access to thermally efficient and fossil gas-free housing, close the global tax havens and loopholes for the corporations that can dodge their responsibility, regulation of upstream fossil fuel supply, carbon-centric policies that control demand management, that are demand management as well as supply management. This is referred to in this paper as a Green New Deal, and you may think that's a political term, but it's not. It's actually been used in the scientific literature before Ocasio-Cortez picked it up and applied it to a legislative package. This particular paper is very quantitative in its approach, and it's very compelling. And what it tells me is something that I've become increasingly aware of, is those intersectional social and economic issues are actually the foundation of our ability to make the changes that we need.
That said, I'll press a little bit more. I mean, I think people want to know, although that there are these huge structural changes that need to happen, what do we do to make them happen? Can you give any kind of—
there's a belief out there, and I hope it's founded, that voting is absolutely critically important. So I strongly encourage all young people who are eligible to get out and vote immediately in the midterm elections this year, 2022. And then to vote like your life depends on it then, and in the term elections in 2024, because your life does depend on it. That said, one thing is very clear, and that is, in general, the people have had very little political leverage relative to the fossil fuel corporations and the vested interests and the corruption that exists across our government, especially in the legislative branches in the states and in the federal system. Many of the people that I respect, climate scientists, are advocating civil disobedience, and I am too. I don't want to see any young person destroy their career or their future, but civil disobedience is clearly indicated at this point, and I emphasize nonviolent civil disobedience. I took busloads of students and faculty from regional colleges in Maine. I helped pay for that process. I led that effort to march around Obama's White House to kill the Keystone XL pipeline. And my board of trustees had only one request of me, which kind of saddened me. They said, just don't get arrested, okay? And so I watched as Bill McKibben and James Hansen handcuffed themselves to the White House fence and were arrested. And I think that kind of nonviolent civil disobedience, such as supergluing your hands to Citibank, those sorts of things are being done increasingly by climate scientists all over the world. I strongly recommend that you join with the Sunrise Movement, with the global movement of 350.org, and with the Extinction Rebellion. The Extinction Rebellion initially sounded a bit shrill to me when it first got started. I no longer think so, not at all. I think they're absolutely on the right track. Those are three organizations that you can put your investment in. The other thing that I would recommend that you do is pay close attention to the peoples that have already been through the massive transformations that we're facing. And those are the First Nations peoples and the Native peoples of most of the continents, of all of the continents around the world, especially the Aborigines in Australia. So read their literature, read what's been written about them, hear their oral traditions, and see how they managed to survive dramatic changes and the arrival of colonialism.
Thank you for those ideas. Marcus, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted, there was a note that came up about a protest at Wells Fargo on Friday. I wanted to just make sure everyone saw that. But I wanted to ask Stephen about, I mean, it's easy to see why corporations and governments are downplaying the seriousness of all this. What are your thoughts about universities? It seems like they they understand science. They can look at charts and graphs, and yet, I mean, many of them, of course, have pledged to reduce their own carbon output in 5 or 10 or 15 years or whatever, but they don't seem to be alerting students to the seriousness of the situation in a way that you might think they would. What are your thoughts on that? Why aren't they doing more?
Well, first of all, we have to divide the world between the public and the private institutions. The non-elite private institutions have the ability to divest their investments, for their endowments from fossil fuels. And I led the effort for Unity College to become the first in the nation, and as far as I know in the world, to divest our endowment from the top 200 fossil fuel companies. Many other institutions have followed, some public, some private. It's harder for a public institution to divest because the fiduciary in reality for a public institution is not the board of trustees or the board of governors. It is actually the legislature and the governor of the state. So public institutions, which all receive significant amounts of money from state legislatures, the state legislature has the final say in terms of what the universities actually do with their money. And in Florida, as in many public institutions, the investments of the institution are shielded from public information behind a private foundation that they use. In Florida, it's called the University of Florida Foundation. And even though Florida has a sunshine law that says that the public should be able to see these things, in fact, we have no idea what the University of Florida is invested in. So divestment is job one. Job two is stop taking money from fossil fuel interests for your schools of engineering and for your schools of political science. Florida State University has taken money from very unworthy sources, shall we say, for its social science and political science graduate work. And it's very suspect, frankly. And a number of universities around the country have done this. They have to stop receiving this money and stop using it. And above all, science should not be done with those resources under any circumstances. I used to think that guilt money was okay, I'll use it. But in point of fact, it's simply unethical to use that money, and it must stop. And a number of writers and thinkers in the academy are speaking to this point and writing to this point. So I think higher education has still got a long way to go. We still don't know where the investments are for many of these institutions. And fossil fuel investments, when we divested, the fossil fuel corporations were 18% of the market capitalization in the Standard & Poor's. That's a lot. But my response was, that means there's 82% for us to invest in. So let's figure out what else we can invest in. And that's what we did. So up until very recently, fossil fuels were in the dead last bottom of the Standard & Poor's because they had lost so much value, not out of any desire to save the planet, because their products were not in demand as they once were, and the price of oil was falling. Well, now the price of oil is back above $100 a barrel, and it's important to figure out where those investments are now going. There's no question that the fossil fuel industry wants to destroy our planet. And let me show you some data to back that up. Around the world right now, the fossil fuel industry, and backed by various countries, have an enormous number of what are appropriately called carbon bombs that are in the works, that are actively being planned, the largest being in China and in the United States. And if we look at the total planned carbon bombs, it's an enormous set of emissions into the atmosphere. This will take us far beyond any putative budget for 1.5 degrees. There are 425 fossil fuel projects with more than 1 gigatons of CO2 emissions globally. 40% have not started yet, and there's the potential to stop them, but the others are already underway. If you look at what big oil has in mind for us, Chevron and ExxonMobil in particular refuse to do anything. Across the top is ambition, integrity, and people-centered transitions. These guys are the enemy. I don't know what they think is going to happen, or if they really think that tech-based geoengineering is going to save them. It's not. But anyway, thanks for letting me show you those two figures. But anyway, I think we still have a long way to go in terms of higher education. And Harvard just agreed to divest, but in fact, are they really divesting? I'd like to see the details.
Great.
I just want, thanks, Dr. Mulkey. I just want to point to, let's see, there's another question I'd like you to respond to, but I do want to point out that Becky Daggett, who is has been on our council here in Flagstaff, has recommended to folks that they consider running for local office. So many critical decisions are made locally, and she knows that, and that's absolutely true. And here in Flagstaff, we really need people running for council this time around.
I agree. Vote, civil disobedience, run for office.
Let me turn to another question here, which is on probably, right, comes out of the worst case scenario here. And it's, let's assume that transformational change will not happen in time to limit catastrophic impacts. What should we be doing to prepare as individuals and as local communities?
There are many things to do. I've, for a few years, taught a course on communities and climate change, and it's one of the courses that I'll probably be developing for online delivery. But the community is the front line of adaptation and transformation. It's not the state or the feds, it's actually the community, especially if we aren't able to make the massive geopolitical changes that are necessary worldwide. So somebody always comes up to me after I give a public talk and they say, hey, where can I move to? And I always think, boy, what a coward. But after I give them some good natured ribbing, I say, really, there's no place. You've got one planet. There are some places that will have differential impacts at different times, and the devil's in those details. But Bill McKibben says, any place there's a community that comes together, any place there's an active community that wants to build capacity for responding to this change. And that's what I recommend. And if you can't find one, make one where you live. So that's the most important element, is the community level responses, how you do your housing, how you do your transportation. All of this happens at the county commission level and the city commission level, these municipalities that are making these big decisions about allocation of resources, tax dollars. You need to be strongly influencing these, and again, run for office. As individuals and for your family, I don't advise that you go become a prepper and build an underground bunker. I think, first of all, it won't work. And secondly, we need to recognize that we are obligately social primates. If you think that you can get along without engaging with your friends and neighbors, you're wrong. It simply won't happen. We have no fur, no claws, no fangs, and we don't run very fast. And so on the African savanna, all by ourselves, will be somebody's lunch in short order, or I would suggest at the boardroom table. We need each other. And that is not negotiable. We need each other. And the place that we need to engage the most at is within our communities. How many of you really know who your neighbors are? Right next door. Do you know what their needs are? Do you know what their desires are? Do you know what their hopes are? Is anybody sick? Does anybody have cancer? Does anybody have lung disease? What do they think about climate change? What do they think about global heating? What do they think about alternative energy? You can engage these topics in a non-threatening manner and develop the dialogue to start to develop a strong sense of community. There's so much more to be said here. One thing that I would advise young people to do is don't dedicate your life to a career track. You will change your career title probably multiple times in your lifetime. And that's a good thing. Don't try to lock yourself into something. One of the most amazing things as a faculty member is a 18 or 17-year-old student will walk in my office and tell me exactly what they were going to be doing when they were 35 years old. Oh, really now? It just doesn't work like that. Set out a general area that you care passionately about and exuberantly engage in meaningful work. And anybody you can identify that has a meaningful and productive life that is dedicated to something beyond their own self-interest, find out how they're doing it. Listen closely to what they have to say. Dedication to self is an empty shell. It simply won't work. So in terms of your financial resources, many of you are going to be starting your adult life with very limited financial resources. Nevertheless, engage in meaningful work, even if it means volunteering initially. This is the richest country in the nation. It's pretty clear that you probably will not starve. You will probably have to live closely with other with peers for extended periods. Get used to it. You're not going to have the single family dwelling with the 2 cars in the garage and commute out of the suburbs every day. If you want that, then you're part of the problem and not part of the solution. I hope that helps.
Thank you so much. We are at time, I think, and I think this is a good place for us to stop, to bring you, knowing that knowing that you'll come back, um, knowing that we have a recording of this presentation that we'll make available to everyone. If you don't, you'll be able to find it on the Flagstaff College website. You can also email me directly. I put my email in the chat, and let me know if you want me to send you that recording directly. But this is a very moving and distressing and also inspiring presentation. And I think that your wisdom around what we need to be doing and how important it is that we live together in community is so valuable for us to hear over and over again. So thank you so much, Dr. Mulkey. And
It's been my privilege. I hope I'm useful. Yeah. So don't hesitate to reach out to me. And this is my meaning and purpose in my life right now. So I'm honored and grateful to be doing it.
Well, we so much appreciate your leadership. And thank you everyone for joining us this evening. Please, when you have the recording in hand, send it out far and wide. And let us know if we should do another presentation here with Dr. Mulkey or on related topics. Good night, everyone. Again, thank you for joining us.